morning, everyone. It's great to be with you once again in an LGW Frontline conversation. We're thrilled to have Tamara Copeland, one of the thought leaders in the region. And I want to introduce Sonia McCormick, who's with PNC Bank, who are our sponsors for this series of conversations we're having with leaders around the region. So Sonia, welcome, and please say a few words.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everybody. Hello, LGW colleagues. I miss all of you guys very much, missing everybody in person, but I am just thrilled that we can continue to be in dialogue during these virtual sessions. And I want to give a shout out to Doug and Debbie and Chase and the whole LGW team for everything that they've done to keep us together. I mean, I think LGW has really proven what this membership organization is all about. You guys are great leaders, and the fact that you really pivoted when we all started working from home to put these frontline conversations together, I think just speaks volumes about your work. And you obviously know I'm one of your biggest fans. So, and as everybody I think knows, we've been the sponsor for 4 years now of Lessons in Leadership, which we have hosted at PNC Place for a long time. And we bring great leaders to our building, and we are dying to get to a point where we can host you again. But since that's gonna be a little while, LGW reached out to us and asked if we'd be interested in hosting these series of conversations, and it just seemed like a natural fit. So we are thrilled to be a part of this, especially, so all the conversations, but especially this morning. Obviously racism is an issue that we're all taking very seriously, and it's not an easy issue to talk about, but I applaud everybody who is on the front lines of this, and especially our speaker this morning. Before I have a chance to say a few words about tomorrow, I just want to give a little shout out to my own company, to PNC. So hopefully everybody saw in the news our $1 billion commitment to promoting racial equity and fighting for social justice. So we're obviously very proud of that. It's going to be a lot of work ahead of us. Most of the dollars are going toward community development, but there is going to be $50 million that is going to be allocated toward philanthropic investments. So we're still trying to figure it all out, and our very own Richard Bynum actually is the person who is going to be implementing all that. So class of 2013, yay, want to give him a shout out. This is a really big deal for him. He's been promoted to a new position at PNC called Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer, and he's going to be reporting directly to our CEO, Bill Demchek. So look out for more information, and maybe he can be a future speaker at one of these sessions. He wanted me to send you his regards, and he's obviously very excited that we're doing this as well. So turning on to tomorrow, 4 years ago, Tamara Copeland came to PNC. We're been a long supporter of WRAG, Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. I do the charitable giving along with my colleague, Terry Copeland, and others. And she asked us if we would be willing to host a series of conversations that she had a vision for called Putting Racism on the Table. And it was very intriguing and courageous of her. And so we were thrilled to do it. And I'm not going to steal all of her thunder because I know she's going to talk about it, but I think it was just important for us as grant makers. I mean, she saw that, a lot of us give money to people who are disenfranchised, but many of us don't really understand the root causes of those issues. So she and the speakers, who were all very thought-provoking, engaged us in some serious dialogue, and it was really honest conversations. So I think it was a great beginning, and I know she's going to talk about that today. So I won't steal her thunder. I know she's going to discuss that. In the meantime, let me just say she's a very good friend, somebody I greatly admire, a talented author, and just a courageous woman. So the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you.
Sonia, thank you very much, and thanks PNC for your support for these important conversations that LGW is having. So Tamara, welcome. It's great to see you, great to be with you.
Thanks, Doug.
We're all big fans of yours, I gotta say. So we're gonna talk about putting racism on the table. Before we do that, how are you feeling personally? How's your health? How's your mental health? How's everything going with you? How are you doing in these times of COVID?
It's truly been an emotional roller coaster. I mean, I think that feeling outrage and sadness around the murder of George Floyd, and then being uplifted by the protests that ensued, including the removal of Confederate monuments from my hometown of Richmond, Virginia, and certainly uplifted by that. Utter sadness around the death of Elijah McClain. I mean, then inspired by all of the celebration of the life of Congressman John Lewis. So it's been an emotional roller coaster. But I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate all that LGW is doing, and I appreciate what PNC did for us and continues to do in the community. So thanks to Sonia as well.
Well, we've got a lot of your class members in the class of 2004 shouting out to you on this call.
No, it's a huge shout out to 2004. We do more.
We do more. There you go. So you came up with this idea of putting racism there. And the reason that we're talking with you today is because you are such a thought leader in the region. When I came to LGW and decided to do some kind of thought leadership series, and we pick a topic and do a deep dive into that topic for a few months, you and I talked and you suggested affordable housing. And we went with that because I didn't want to sort of start something new. I wanted to talk about something that other organizations in the region were talking about. And then after we finished that, which is very successful, we basically followed you along the racial equity guidelines. You had done a series called Putting Racism on the Table with the WRAG membership. And we then put together a racial equity series for LGW and WRAG members that was very successful as well. So how did you, that's years before what we're going through now. Where did the idea come from? How did that work? What motivated you to do that?
Well, you know, Doug, I certainly can't take credit for all of this. There was a group of people that were philanthropic leaders who were, I think, trying to figure out what they were going to do following the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and recognizing that Baltimore was right up the road, and what we were going to do. A group of people came together and sat around the conference room table at WRAG, and it became pretty clear fairly immediately that folks were suggesting interventions which were the same interventions that had been done for some time. I mean, so there were conversations about what to do with the education system. There were conversations about housing and recognizing that lead-based paint was found in his home, and just all of the things that, you know, we typically talk about. And finally, and the other point that's important, I think, is that people finally started talking about race. But it became clear that we were using terms interchangeably and incorrectly. And finally, someone said, the first step in leadership is not action, it's understanding. And that was a quote. And recognizing that there was so much about race and racism that we didn't understand. And at the time, just remembered the series that the Community Foundation had done when Terry Freeman was still there, and the series was called Putting Race on the Table. And the whole premise, it was done in conjunction with the Smithsonian, and the whole premise was that we aren't, as humans, we aren't that different. And just recognizing that whatever the percentage is, 97% that we're all the same, whatever that percentage is, but the 3% that we're—
It's 99.9.
Thank you.
DNA.
So the 0.01% that makes us different in races seems to have had an impact that we wanted to discuss. And so racism became the topic that we truly wanted to explore. And I applaud those 10 or 12 philanthropic leaders who stood beside me and with WRAG and supported that kind of a conversation.
So you started that several years ago, and tell us a little bit about the series of some of the topics that you covered. And I will say that your comment that you first started talking about some of the same things you've been doing, or people have been doing for a long time. That's the way I felt this summer with George Floyd, and we talked to Howard John Wesley from his church in Alexandria. And I said, you were on a panel that we had 5 years ago talking about police-community relations and police brutality. And here we are 5 years later, nothing seems to have changed. If anything, it seems to have gotten worse. So there's got to be a level of frustration with that too.
Well, you know, I think that there was this confluence of events. The pandemic and everyone being at home, working from home. And George Floyd was clearly murdered when we watched for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while a police officer very cavalierly put his knee on this man's neck as he did all of the things that Black parents, and obviously George Floyd's an adult, but as a parent of an African-American young man, you know, these are the things that we tell our children. We tell our children to be respectful, that we will argue this later. You know, do what the police officer says to do. And George Floyd did all of that. And for us to witness that, it certainly galvanized a movement. And I do think, though, Doug, that this is far more than a moment. I think this is a movement. You know, I do this monthly blog and just write about things that occur to me and that I think it offers a vantage point that maybe some others don't see. And on May the 8th, I posted a blog that was called White People Step It Up. And so the 8th of May, and it talked about how Black people will always be advocates for justice. We always have been and we always will be. But there is a predominance of white people in positions of power, and we need those voices to take a leadership role. And it was the blog that got the most views of any I've ever done. George Floyd was murdered on May the 25th. And early in June, if not late in May, I really don't know the dates, but you saw Native Americans and Latinx and Asian Americans and African Americans and white people who were outraged by what had happened and were ready for justice. So while I think that we're talking about something that we've been talking about for a number of years, decades, if not centuries, that we are moving to actions in a way that we haven't had perhaps since the 60s.
Do you see it as a movement and not a moment?
I do.
What makes you confident that this is here to stay? We all hope that.
Well, I hope, you know, I always say I hope that Pollyanna doesn't live in my house, but I really, when you see police officers who are kneeling with protesters, when you see people in the media who are recognizing that the protesters are peaceful and that there are other people who are coming in to cause disruptions, and you see those media messages being delivered. I think when you see governors who are recognizing what needs to happen in their jurisdictions. You know, it's not a major message, but it is significant, I think, when the governor of Virginia decides that Juneteenth is going to be a day that's recognized by the state of Virginia, that the Commonwealth of Virginia, he did not have time to get the level of approval that was necessary to make it a state holiday. But on his own, he gave all of the state employees the day off and promised that he would work for it to become a state holiday at some point. So I know that some suggest that those kinds of actions are performative, and perhaps they are, but I like to think that they are leading to changes in perception and actions that will be substantive and that we have moved beyond symbolism.
How about the mom wall in Portland? That was really fascinating to me. Just mothers from across the Portland area coming together and just standing there peacefully protesting, protecting the protesters from police violence.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that you have seen a number of incidents where people stood up in a way that they have not stood up before. There's you know, a lot of conversation about we have to move beyond learning to action. And I would never argue with that. But I think that that's what we're doing. And I think that in some ways we're doing it simultaneously, that people are reading and watching podcasts and signing on to events like this. I know that, you know, you're leading the LGW is leading a series on race and racism. I know Chuck Bean at COG is doing some work, Heather Raspberry at HAND, that there are a number of organizations that are taking leadership positions and wanting to help their members learn, but also wanting to engage with their membership and to take actions.
So let's get back to the Putting Racism on the Table series.
Yeah.
And Beverly Hudnut just sent in a message that doing that series with us and then going on the civil rights learning journey with us has changed her life tremendously. She's very, very thankful for being able to participate in that and everything she's learned from there. So if you said it started out as we're going to educate people, we're going to provide learning. What are some of the things that if people want to educate themselves, what are some of the things they need to do?
Well, you know, we did 6 sessions. We started out with a session, the first session had John Powell in the first series, and in the second series we had Ibram Kendi, Dr. Ibram Kendi, talking about structural racism and trying to educate the community to the fact that this isn't about the bad behavior of any one person, but it is about systems, it's cultural, it's historical, it's interpersonal, it's institutional. It is the whole array of our world that, that is somewhat invisible to many, particularly many white people. I mean, you get in a room of Black people, we probably talk about race every day. And if we don't talk about it, we are aware of it. Whereas for white people, that you had to be educated to something that I think many were not aware of. So that level of education in which we talked about structural racism in the first session. And for those who don't know, there were 6 months of learning. We did 1 session a month, always at PNC, 1 session a month, 1 hour of a speaker, and then 2 hours of a facilitated conversation. The first session was structural racism. The second was white privilege, I believe. The third, implicit bias. Then we did a case study where we looked at all 3 of those factors and how they interacted within one system. And for that, we chose initially the criminal justice system or the criminal injustice system. Then we wanted to recognize that we had been focused in large measure on the dynamic between the Black community and the white community that really obviously had its start in slavery. And so we wanted to recognize the kind of the racial mosaic of America. And so we had the 5th speaker did exactly that. And then we closed with a speaker who focused on what, in the first instance anyway, what philanthropy could do. And so when we partnered with LGW, it was really about what the region could do and how we were going to move forward and how we were going to move beyond learning to action.
So you mentioned Ibram Kendi, and we're very fortunate to have him. And then I'm smiling because Julia Wilson is asking, would you recommend the book White Fragility?
I would. I know that.
Well, we had Robin DiAngelo come and speak.
We had her twice. I think that she has a powerful message for white people that is heard differently than if it's delivered by an African-American or another person of color. That she is able to speak to her own experience of how she is treated as a white person and how she has recognized the need to understand the Black experience and to also use her power and privilege to affect change. Yeah.
We talk about the civil rights learning journey that you all put together, that LGW partnered with. And
yeah.
it's incredibly moving. You and I were together through that whole thing.
Yeah, we were.
We had the Pettus Bridge together. And
that's right.
So moving. Where did that idea come from? How did that originate? And tell us.
I think one of the things that I believe WRAG did well was that we tried to look for various ways of making race and racism real, and that it's not just having someone stand in front of you and deliver a lecture as powerful as a Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo's messages were, we took people to the theater. We went to Arena Stage twice, once to see a play called Smart People, once to see Native Gardens. We asked for participants to share their views on what they were experiencing, so that this wasn't just about WRAG, but the experience of I know that Nikki Gorin and Josh Bernstein, I think, were the first people who wrote about how they were experiencing putting racism on the table. So we wanted people to share their views. We had, at one of the annual meetings, we had David Williams, who's a professor in the School of Public Health at Harvard, and his speech was labeled "The House That Racism Built." And then the last speaker before I retired was Titus Kaffar, an artist who talked about unseen and what's unseen in visual arts. So there were a number of ways that we tried to make this subject real, so that it wasn't only coming to you from one direction. You know, and there was one thing we did where we had a dancer. She was, her name is Holly Bass. And her dance was overlaid with messages by 4 people from the philanthropic community: Unique Redwood, Jennifer Lockwood Shabbat, Wilt Corcoran, and Nat Williams. And they talked about their own personal experiences. So all of this was just how to build a layered level of understanding about race and racism. So the trip to the South, which we called our Civil Rights Learning Tour, we started in Memphis and went to the National Civil Rights Museum. But then we went through the Delta of Mississippi, and as Doug, as you said, we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We walked across that. But we were also joined on the tour by a man who had been a part of the summer learning experiences, the summer freedom schools in Mississippi. So having his firsthand experience about that, or going to Medgar Evers' house and realizing that he didn't have a front door. His house was constructed. He didn't move into a house that was already built. He had his house built, and it didn't have a front door because he thought he would be such a target as he was trying to register people to vote in Mississippi. So he had a carport on the side. Remember, Doug, on the side of the house? Absolutely. And he would drive under the carport and then slide across to the passenger side and go directly into his house. He had windows built at a higher level so that no one could take direct aim at his children. And when he was killed, the night he was killed, he was getting placards out of the trunk of his car before going in. So I certainly think that experience, I believe that everyone said that it was transformational in understanding the civil rights movement and the history of fighting for freedom in this country in a very different way. And one more thing, Doug, what we had hoped for both putting racism on the table as well as for the civil rights tour was that you built a cohort of people who had a different kind of familiarity with each other, a different language that they could use, so that we were normalizing a language as well as creating a group of people who could continue these conversations, as many have, as Beverly commented, as many have over the course of the years.
The learning journey was just, it was so extraordinary. It was very uplifting and yet very depressing at the same time, because we were traveling from place to place where here's where the 4 little girls got blown up, here's where Martin Luther King Jr. got killed, here's where Medgar Evers got killed, here's where the 3 civil rights workers got killed. It just was one murder scene after another, but it really told a great story and tied a lot of things together for those of us who were on it. And I remember at the end of it saying, the more things changed, the more they sort of remain the same. A lot of what was happening back then was all about voting rights. And we are seeing today still the same fights about voting rights for all Americans. Again, it's uplifting, but it's, we've been through this fight before. Can we move on to another one? And yet we're still fighting the same fight.
Well, I think the intentionality in which some are fighting to prevent different groups of people from having the voting rights that they have earned, that, you know, we recognize, I think, what Nicole Hannah-Jones said, that Black people have been part of forever what has made democracy real in this country, because we always have to fight for our freedom. And so the words that this country was founded upon, they weren't true when they were written, and they still aren't true. And, but I think that the good news of the story is that increasingly people realize that, people in positions of power realize that there are hidden factors, the invisibility of racism, that there are hidden factors that prevent people from exercising some of those rights that were won and in the civil rights movement. You know, I just heard about LeBron James, that LeBron James and a group of athletes are paying all the fines and fees of formerly incarcerated felons in Florida. Because in Florida, you can vote if you are a former felon, but you can't vote unless every fee that you owe and every fine that has been placed against you for whatever reason, that all of those have to be paid. And that's an exorbitant amount of money for a lot of people. And LeBron James has put together a group of people who are, the last I heard, it was $100,000. I don't know if it's grown to be probably more than that by this point, but they're going to pay those. And so you think that, you hear that felons in Florida have been given the right to vote, which they should have anyway if they've paid their debt to society through their incarceration and they're now out, but you have to keep reading. And I think that's always the reality, Doug, that you have to keep kind of peeling back the onion. There's always more to see, there's more to understand. APFE talks about, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, they talk about back mapping and making sure that you truly understand what is being presented and what's not being said.
Well, here's the catch-22 in Florida. As you said, to vote, you have to pay off all your fines and your fees.
Yeah.
However, if you go to the courthouse and say, okay, I want to pay it off, they say, well, we don't have, we know you owe something, we don't have the records of what you owe, so we can't tell you how much to pay. So we've got to find those first. So again, it's just a smoke screen to get people, or to disenfranchise people from voting.
Well, and I think unless you know that, you know, you would get the news story that said former felons in Florida were given the right to vote, but only 10% of them voted, because you don't know the whole story. Yeah. And so when I look at what's happening in America today, I think that there is a higher level of intentionality in trying to make sure we fully understand why. And so the fact that you just shared, I didn't know that. And so I think that, you know, we have to keep revealing and exposing those inequities that are, I think, pretty intentional.
If you don't want people to vote, you can maneuver the bureaucracy all kinds of different ways to prevent them from voting. As I said, it's very frustrating, and it's anti-American what they're doing. So let me get to some of the questions we've got from the people watching. And let me start with Lee Corey, who asks, how can we as leaders help move organizations forward when there are still many management people with deeply embedded negative biases? And then he follows up with, how do you inspire corporations to weed out discriminatory individuals who masquerade as leaders and hide behind PR marketing?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
But I think that's a real question. And I think that when so many companies put out statements following the murder of George Floyd, and they said the right words, most of them. But the question becomes, Kaepernick, you know, they have apologized for what they did, but the last I heard, he still wasn't working for the NFL in any way. So we have to recognize the need to hold people accountable and to look for ways to continue to reveal the inequities that exist. I think that, you know, there's a, Maya Angelou said, when you know better, do better. I think that we are beginning to know better, and we have to hold people accountable to do better. And we have to speak up that, you know, we often are hesitant to call someone out on what they do. And I think we have to stop hesitating to do that and acknowledge the fact that perhaps it was not your intent to be racist, to implement policies that are racist, but that is the impact of what you are doing. That is the result of what you're doing. It may not have been your goal, perhaps, but that is what is happening. And I think we have to continue to say that.
We've got a question from Selena Singleton talking about the Montgomery County Racial Equity and Social Justice Act. She's on their advisory committee. What one or two goals would you recommend local governments work on in this area?
Well, first, hey to Selena from 2004. You know, there's certainly a number of jurisdictions who have started establishing racial equity offices or officers of racial equity. I think Fairfax County was the first to do it, and a number of other jurisdictions have done that. I know that there's a lot of work that has been done through GARE, the Government Alliance for Racial Equity. We had Julie Nelson was from GARE as one of the speakers for putting racism on the table. So they have numerous interventions that local governments can use to affect change, to see to it that their workforce understands. I still think the learning is important, but to look specifically at the kinds of actions that local governments can take. So I would recommend GARE as a resource to anyone who's working at the local level.
And we have a question from Rasheem Rook. What are your thoughts on Gen Z and the use of technology as a tool to combat racism and white supremacy?
What are my thoughts on what? Say it again.
Gen Z and their use of technology.
Gen Z and their use of what?
Technology to combat racism and white supremacy.
I think I mean, that's what I was trying to say about WRAG, that we have to utilize every tool we possibly can. And certainly technology is one of those. So I am delighted that folks from every generation, you know, I really do think this, Doug. I think that there are folks that are engaged in this work across generations. We aren't necessarily doing it the same way. You know, so I'm a baby boomer, you know, the baby boomers aren't doing it the way the millennials are, et cetera. But I think that we are all trying to have an impact in the way that we can. I heard about this young woman. She was at Drake University in Iowa, African-American student. And she was encountering some racism at the university. And when she would talk to her fellow students there, or fellow students, yeah, there, you know, people would say, well, that's not what the dictionary defines as racism. And when she looked at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, she realized that it talked about individual actions. And so she wrote them. She wrote the dictionary folks to say, this is not complete enough. You aren't talking about structural racism. You're talking about individual acts of animus. That's not enough. The dictionary is going to change their definition. So we all have platforms. We all have a voice. We all have the ability to affect change. So I might be doing it differently from that young woman at Drake, or I may not be using technology because God knows I don't know how. But I use the voice that I have and the platforms that I can to raise my voice and to hopefully affect change in the way that I can.
So we've got a question from Robert Harvey. At what point do people with power and privilege start demanding action through dollars to our governments rather than asking for concessions through policy? And it's linked to a comment from Angela Hackley, who wants to know what are your thoughts on reparations?
So the first question I'm going to need you to repeat, but the second question, Angela's question about reparations, You know, I just read, as I suspect many people on this call have read, this pretty provocative piece from Nicole Hannah-Jones that was in New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago. And I think that she lays out a very strong case for why without reparations, there will never be equity. And when you look at the data and the data that suggests that for African-American families to have the wealth of white families, it would take 228 years was the last number that I heard. And to acknowledge the barriers that have been put in place that have prevented African Americans from succeeding since the time we were brought to this country, and how free labor from enslaved people built the wealth of the country. I mean, both the wealth as far as crops in the South and industrial labor in the North, that people have been underpaid and have been abused and used and have not been able to reap the rewards of the country that they helped to build. So I am certainly in favor of reparations. I don't know how else you can get there. And when you have people who talk about those typical interventions of education, et cetera, which are all very important, but it suggests that to address poverty in the Black community is the same as addressing poverty in the white community. And it is not. The reasons that have contributed to poverty in the Black community are very different. And you know, you just look at something like applying for jobs. And Doug, you know this, that all the studies that will tell you that if the person goes in whose name is Catherine Smith and the person goes in whose name is Shaniqua Smith, that you're gonna think that Shaniqua is African-American, and you will have created a whole biography of her without knowing one thing about her beyond her name. So people who have the same credentials don't get the same level of attention within the business community. And Angela, that was a question that I can talk about for a long time. So I do think that reparations are the only way to go. And we know that reparations are not unusual in this country. We know that in Washington, D.C., that former slave owners were paid reparations so that their enslaved people could be freed. So they paid these white owners. We know that following the Civil War, when there was the idea that when Sherman talked to formerly enslaved people and said, what do you need to get a good start in this country? And they said, we need land. 400,000 acres were intended to be shared with formerly enslaved people. Some of that land was given. And then when, I guess, Andrew Johnson became president, he said no, and took that land back. So all of those efforts to move toward equity have not been realized in this country. And at this point in time, I don't know what would do that beyond, besides reparations.
I think you got the first question answered as part of that as well.
Okay.
How about from Julie Wilson, specific actions white people can take to push the movement forward to make sure it stays a movement?
Well, I mean, I think that, there's this great document that's been on Facebook and everywhere that it started out, it was 62 things that white people can do to affect change. And the last I heard it was 97. It's probably 140 now. I mean, I think that you have to use the space that you have. You have to use your conversations with your next door neighbor. You have to use your platforms in your child's school. You have to use whatever is happening in your house of worship. There are so many places and so much power that we have. and that we kind of ignore. You know, there was always this notion of not talking about race, that people always said, you know, well, you know, we're all part of the human race. We are going to be colorblind. But when we're colorblind, that we don't acknowledge the culture, the history, what has happened to people because of their color in many instances. So I'm not going to be able to articulate specific examples of things that you can do, but there are lists out there of all of the different interventions, writing to your state legislators, you know, promoting change within your business community. There are tons of documents out there that will suggest ways that you can affect change.
Catherine Clay has a question about the movement today that we're talking about. Do you feel that is going to help us move forward to kill the roots of systemic racism?
To kill the roots of racism? Systemic racism. Yeah, I actually do. I think there is a different level of understanding about race and racism in this country. And I actually believe that part of that was because of George Floyd. That when we watched that on television, that the whole concept of Black Lives Matter, not necessarily the organization, but what those words mean, that people got a clear sense of a Black man's life that didn't seem to matter. And I believe that we have over time now been looking back at, you know, Ahmaud Arbery and looking at Breonna Taylor, thinking more critically about all of these incidents that have happened over time, and being more aware of not blaming the victim. You know, I think the inclination, if we hadn't had the cell phone video of whatever, that young woman, I think she's 17-year-old who caught that on videotape. If we hadn't had that videotape, someone would have said, oh, I'm sure there's something else happened. I'm sure there was some reason. You know, that there's always a belief that it can't be as bad as that. You know, it just can't be. And I think that the Black experience in America, it is difficult for white people to understand it. And, you know, I know that there are a lot of Black people who say you have to go out there and do your own learning. And I think that's true. But I think to some degree, you also need a guide. You need someone who is African-American to sometimes explain things to you that you just don't see, because your mind does not want to believe that things are as horrible as Black people know that they have been in this country. And if we didn't have these cell phones that have been capturing these moments over the last 4 or 5 years, just to think about how much has happened in this world that was never captured on a cell phone video, and therefore the event was minimized, or you thought something else had happened. You know, Doug, you'll remember when we were on the civil rights tour, and they were talking about when they found Emmett Till's body in the river, and all the other bodies that they found that had never been reported, because what was the point in reporting them? Nobody cared. People in power were not going to care about what had happened to these poor African-American people. And so I think that there is a different experience now than there has been in the past.
It is a different experience. I mean, Emmett Till, it was the picture of him in his open casket. Shocked the world. Now we are seeing things, I'm sorry to say, almost on a daily basis of brutality and wrongs committed, but we do have the cell phones to capture. We're able to see that now. And I think being able to see something makes a huge difference. I think that has led quite a bit to the movement that's happening today. Let me ask you about leadership lessons that you've learned in the last few months during COVID and during this unrest. Do you have any guidance for us on that?
You know, I don't know that I have learned anything, but I've had a lot of important reminders. You know, the death of John Lewis just reminded me of the importance of having a moral core and staying with what you know is right and always being true to that. Just recognizing the protesters over the last few months and just acknowledging the power of a peaceful protest, that how you have to use the power of your feet, the power of your voice to get attention, and how important it is for those protesters to be of many races and ethnicities and religions, that this is not the battle of one people. It is the battle for America, that we want America to be the democracy that it was set up to be.
So any LGW members reach out to you these past couple months? Have you reached out to any LGW members for help? We've got it.
You know, this isolation has been something. You know, my 2004 class, that we have Zoom calls and we have socially distanced gatherings. You know, this is a class that travels together. We are a close group of people. So certainly having 2004 as part of my support and part of my inspiration and part of what helps to keep me sane. But you should also know that I'm also a part of another group that started as a result of a dinner that was an LGW dinner. And Kelly Darnell had hosted this dinner and had said she wanted to host a dinner where the topic was going to be about racial equity. And so that group, we get together via Zoom call. So, you know, it's hard to be in this region and not have a lot of people who are LGW members who are supporting you in lots of ways. And I certainly feel the love and the support and the inspiration from LGW.
Katie Moore sends a shout out saying you're the busiest retired person she's ever met. So.
You know, Katie's part of my inspiration too.
Other than subscribing to your monthly blog and buying your book, Daughters of the Dream, what are some ways we can help you?
Well, you know, I think that it's about using your voice, Doug. You know, what happened to George Floyd or Emmett Till or the whole host of names that unfortunately we can't recount because there are far too many for us to name them all. You know, within the African American community, we have known this forever. I mean, we have known this. We have known what happens. Just to share a quick story of my son. He was at the time 22 years old, coming out the front door of our house at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Two police officers on bicycles were riding down the street and they yelled at him, "What are you doing?" And he said, you know, I didn't even know they were talking to me because I wasn't doing anything. And he said they stopped and got off their bikes and their voices got deeper and more serious. And they said, you know, I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm coming out of my front door. Didn't you see me lock it?" And they said, "Oh, you live there?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And he pulled out his driver's license and showed it to them. And this was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, coming out of the front door of a house. He wasn't running. He didn't have anything. He was actually on his way to a doctor's appointment. He didn't actually live here at the time, but fortunately his driver's license said he did. And I was still at WRAG when this happened, and he called me at work and he told me what had happened. And I said, "Are you okay?" "Oh yeah, Ma, it's no big deal." But it was a big deal. First, he would not have called me at work to tell me he stopped at Subway to get a sandwich. He would not have called me about something that wasn't a big deal. So it clearly was a big deal. And I was put in the position of having to decide what I was going to do. So am I going to say to him, you did exactly the right thing? Or am I going to say, you don't have to prove to someone that you live there. You weren't doing anything wrong. And so I tell that story as an example of what Black parents face all the time. And the privilege when white people say, you know, I don't know what you're talking about white privilege, and fewer are saying that. But the conversation about how to engage with police officers is a conversation that most white parents don't have to have, and don't have to say to their children that you did the right thing by proving that you lived in the house that you were calmly coming out of and locking the front door. So I just think that's an important reminder that we may, within the LGW community, I think we may present as being essentially the same people, but we are not having the same experience in the DMV or in America. And we are all working to have that level of equity and that level of a shared experience in America that we like to think we all have.
Tamara, I can't thank you enough for this conversation today. One of the greatest joys of me joining LGW was getting to work with you. And you are one of my favorite people in the world. I really, really think the world of you.
Well, that is very generous. Now, you know that I am a groupie for LGW, so, I mean, and
we appreciate that.
I will say that LGW changed my life. There's no question about it. I went through LGW in 2004, and the people that I met in my class and the people that I continued to meet because of the connections with Leadership Greater Washington, and the way that this organization has grown from being certainly the networking phenomenon that it is, but also to being a vehicle for change in our region. So I appreciate your leadership, Doug, and I appreciate all that this organization is doing in the community.
Let me turn it back to you for the final word for today.
Well, you know, I thought about what the final word would be, and I know that I knew that you were going to do that, and you know, I've been thinking about it a long time, and thinking about the fact that people want us to get to racial healing, and for a while there was a lot of conversation about racial healing, and I just want to say that I've thought about it, and I want to get there too. I want us to be healed. I want us to be a whole country. And I think for me that there are 3 steps, and this is what I will leave with. There are 3 steps to racial healing. And the first is reveal. And I think that reveal for me means to learn, that you have to understand all that is happening to people who don't look like you in America. So you have to read, you have to learn. So it's reveal is the first. And the second is to reflect on what you've learned. You know, I like to give this example of, I hope I can do it quickly because I know we're running out of time, but to reflect, you know, there's this whole notion about Ryan Lochte. Some people may remember him. He's a swimmer, Olympic swimmer in Brazil, in Rio, when the Olympics were there. And he had all kinds of acting out behavior. And the officials of the Olympics, they said, oh, just remember, you know, boys will be boys. They're just kids. They were here to have a good time. Well, they were in their 30s. Tamir Rice was 12 years old, playing in a park in Cleveland with a toy gun. So this whole notion of, we have to reflect on, we have to think about these comparisons of how different people are treated. American Psychological Association says African-American kids as young as 10 are viewed as adults. So reveal, reflect, and the last is recalibrate, that we have to change. There's so much in America that needs to be adjusted, needs to be changed. Some of it in small ways and some of it in major ways. But I am delighted to be a part of Leadership Greater Washington. And I thank you for this conversation, Doug.
Tamara, thank you so much. I truly enjoyed this. It was very, very inspirational, as I knew it would be. All right, everybody, thank you very much for joining us. Please join us next week for our next Frontline conversation, and we'll see you then. Have a great day.
Good.